Rahab is a remarkable figure in the Bible, mentioned surprisingly in a context that few would expect. Her name appears at one of the most critical moments in Israel's history, during the conquest of the Promised Land, and she is remembered not only for who she was, but for her actions and, most importantly, for the faith she demonstrated. Despite her profession and life seemingly far from divine standards, Rahab emerges as an example of how God can use the most unlikely people to accomplish his grand plans. Rahab is mentioned in Scripture not only in the context of her city, Jericho, but also in a place of honor in the genealogy of Jesus Christ, which is a profound revelation about the transformative power of faith. She teaches us that God does not look at what others see in us. He sees the potential for redemption and transformation that dwells in the heart willing to believe. Her story is not just about an ordinary woman, but about someone who, through faith, was inserted into a divine plan much greater than she could have imagined. Now, let's dive into her story and discover what makes Rahab one of the most inspiring characters in the Bible. Rahab lived in Jericho, a strategic city in the Promised Land and the first to be conquered by the Israelites under the leadership of Joshua. Jericho was a fortified city, known for its idolatry and immoral practices. As part of Canaanite culture, its inhabitants worshipped several pagan gods, directly challenging God's principles. In this hostile environment, Rahab, a woman whose profession was marginalized as a prostitute, was seen by society as someone of little or no value. However, God's plan was very different from human judgment. In Joshua 2 verse 1, God used Rahab in a surprising way. When Joshua sent 2 spies to observe Jericho, they ended up seeking shelter in Rahab's house. This fact alone is a reflection that God can choose anyone for his purposes, regardless of their circumstances or background. Despite her upbringing in a city of idolatry, Rahab demonstrated unusual faith. She acknowledged God's power and sovereignty over Israel and the nations, declaring, "The Lord your God, He is God in heaven above and on the earth below." Joshua 2 verse 11. Rahab was willing to risk her life to protect the spies, trusting that God would protect her. Her faith is one of the most remarkable in the Bible, especially when we consider her background and her position within Jericho. She was not an Israelite woman, and therefore did not grow up hearing stories of God or learning about his law. Instead, Rahab lived in a pagan culture, surrounded by idolatry and a morally corrupt society. Her profession as a prostitute placed her in an even more unfavorable position in the eyes of society. Yet Rahab's faith shone at a critical moment, showing the transformative power of trusting in God. In Joshua 2 verse 11, Rahab makes an extraordinary declaration. "The Lord your God, He is God in heaven above and on the earth below." This statement reveals that she recognized God's sovereignty over all things, both in heaven and on earth. What's even more surprising is that Rahab makes this statement before she even sees any miracles directly. She heard about the wonders God had done for Israel, such as parting the Red Sea and defeating powerful kings, Joshua 2 verses 9 to 10. And that was enough to make her believe. Rahab's faith was not just a theoretical belief, but a faith that led to action. In an act of courage and obedience, Rahab decided to hide the Israelite spies in her home, risking her own life. She knew that if she were discovered, she would be killed by the men of Jericho. However, her trust in God was greater than her fear of punishment. Not only did she hide the spies, but she also lied to the Jericho guards, leading them astray, Joshua 2 verses 4 to 6. This act of faith was not based on something she saw with her own eyes, but on what she heard and believed deep in her heart. Rahab teaches us a powerful lesson about the true nature of faith. We often think we need to see miracles or signs before we can believe in God, but true faith often precedes these experiences. In Hebrews 11 verse 1, the Bible tells us that faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Rahab exemplified this definition perfectly. Her faith in God did not depend on physical evidence, but rather on a deep internal conviction about who God was and what he could do. Another remarkable aspect of Rahab's faith is her total commitment to God's plan. She was willing to give up her personal security and her ties to her city to ally herself with the God of Israel. She understood that the destruction of Jericho was imminent and that the only way to survive was to place her faith in the true God. Her faith not only saved her life, but also the lives of her family, Joshua 2 verses 12 to 13. Furthermore, Rahab's faith opened doors she could never have imagined. Not only was her life spared, but she became part of the people of Israel and was eventually included in the lineage of Jesus Christ. Matthew 1 verse 5. This shows us that true faith, even if born in an unfavorable context, can have eternal repercussions and completely transform a person's life. This teaches us that faith knows no barriers of culture, origin, or past. Genuine faith comes from the heart that believes and acts on that belief. Rahab, a woman considered unlikely in the eyes of the world, was honored by God for her faith, demonstrating that he can use anyone who seeks him with all their heart. Faith accompanied by obedience places us under God's protection. She trusted the promises she received and acted as she was instructed. In our walk with God, we are challenged to have the same confidence, to believe the promises of salvation that he offers us and to obey his call. The destruction of Jericho is one of the most impressive stories in the Old Testament, and within it is the amazing story of Rahab's salvation. In Joshua 6, we see how God instructed the Israelites to march around the city for 7 days. On the 7th day, with the sound of trumpets and the shouting of the people, the walls of Jericho fell, and the city was completely destroyed except for one house, Rahab's house. The story of Rahab in the midst of destruction teaches us about God's justice and mercy, and how he always honors those who seek him in faith. The city of Jericho was heavily protected by its walls, which were considered insurmountable. However, God had a specific plan to tear down these barriers and deliver Jericho into the hands of the Israelites without the need for a conventional battle. The Israelites faithfully followed God's instructions, marching around the city for 6 days and, on the 7th day, encircling it 7 times. When the people shouted at the sound of the trumpets, the walls crumbled, demonstrating God's absolute power in dealing with the enemies of his people. While Jericho was doomed to destruction because of its idolatry and wickedness, Rahab, a resident of the city, received salvation through her faith and obedience. She not only believed the stories about the God of Israel, but she also put her trust in him by hiding the spies and obeying his instructions to hang a scarlet cord in the window of her home. Her faith and actions were rewarded. When destruction came, Rahab and her family were spared, as the spies had promised. The mercy God showed Rahab is a powerful reflection of how he acts in the midst of judgment. In Joshua 6 verse 25 we read, "But Joshua spared Rahab the prostitute, her family, and all her possessions, because she had hidden the spies he had sent to Jericho." Even when the entire city was destroyed, Rahab remained safe inside her home. This reminds us that no matter how severe the judgment, those who trust and obey God find protection and mercy. This story teaches us about the nature of God's judgment and also his mercy. Jericho symbolizes the sinful world, destined for destruction because of its rebellion against God. However, Rahab represents those who, despite this corruption, seek God and trust in his promises. She acknowledged God's authority over all things, as she told the spies in Joshua 2 verse 11, "The Lord your God, he is God in heaven above and on the earth beneath." It was this faith that saved her, not her works or her social status. Rahab was not saved because she was righteous or because of her own merit, but because she trusted in the promise she received. In the same way, we are saved by God's grace when we place our faith in Jesus Christ. The scarlet cord that Rahab hung in her window points to the blood of Christ, which is our mark of salvation. Just as the scarlet cord was the sign that separated Rahab's house from destruction, the blood of Christ separates us from the judgment that is to come. In Ephesians 1 verse 7 we read, "In him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins, according to the riches of his grace." In addition to being spared from destruction, Rahab was fully integrated into the people of Israel. Her life was transformed, and she became part of the lineage of Jesus Christ himself, as we see in Matthew 1 verse 5, which mentions her as an ancestor of David and, therefore, of Jesus. This is clear evidence that God can transform any life, no matter the background or circumstances. Rahab, a Canaanite woman and prostitute, was chosen to play a pivotal role in the history of salvation. This story challenges us to reflect on the power of faith and God's grace. Rahab did not just hear about God's power. She acted on that faith, trusting that he was able to save her and her family. In a world destined for destruction, she chose to believe and was saved. Likewise, we live in a world that will one day face God's judgment. But those who put their faith in Christ and trust in his promises will be spared and find eternal salvation. The destruction of Jericho and the salvation of Rahab teach us that God is faithful to fulfill his promises, and that he always extends his mercy to those who sincerely seek him. Even when everything around us seems to be falling apart, we can trust that God will protect and save us, just as he did for Rahab. One of the most moving parts of Rahab's story is that her life was transformed in such a way that she became part of the lineage of the Messiah. We see that Rahab was the mother of Boaz, who married Ruth, and both became ancestors of David, the king of Israel, and, by extension, of Jesus Christ. This shows the redemptive power of God. No matter how far away someone is from God, he can transform and use that person for his eternal purposes. The story of Rahab offers precious lessons for all of us, regardless of where we are in our walk with God. Her life reveals profound truths about grace, faith, and God's purpose for each of us. The story of Rahab is a powerful reminder that God's grace is abundant and his mercy is infinite. He is not limited by our past or the circumstances of our lives. When we put our faith in God, act on that faith, and trust in his promises, he can use us in extraordinary ways to accomplish his purposes. Therefore, like Rahab, we must approach God with humility, recognizing that he is the true Lord of heaven and earth. Our faith should lead us to act in obedience, trusting that God is faithful to fulfill all that he has promised. And most of all, we must remember that God can use us, no matter where we start, to be part of his great work of redemption.